The mountains of Montana have always been a place of wonder, towering peaks that seem to touch the sky, valleys where the wind whispers secrets, and forests so deep that daylight itself struggles to break through. To many it's paradise, but to others, it's a place where people vanish without a trace. On a warm summer morning in 2018, Sarah Mitchell, 32-year-old woman with a radiant smile and a love for the outdoors, set out for what should have been a peaceful day hike along the Pioneer Ridge Trail. She had done this countless times before. Her friends joked she knew those trails better than the back of her own hand. She sent one last text to her sister before heading out. "Be back before dinner. Love you." No one knew. Those words would be the last she would ever send. When Sarah didn't return that evening, worry began to creep in. By the next morning, search teams, rescue dogs, and helicopters were out in full force, combing the rugged landscape. They found her car at the trailhead. They found faint footprints leading into the forest, but then, nothing. It was as if the mountain had swallowed her whole. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and then years. The case grew cold. Tara's family clung to hope, marking her birthdays with candles in the window, refusing to accept the silence as an answer. But with each passing year, hope became harder to hold on to. And then in the fall of 2024, everything changed. A hunter, lost in the backcountry, stumbled upon an old decaying cabin deep in the woods. Its roof sagged under years of snow, its windows shattered by storms. But what was inside was far worse than the loneliness of the place. The hunter's eyes caught something in the black mouth of the stone chimney, something pale. At first he thought it was animal bones, but as he stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. These weren't animal remains. And when investigators arrived, they confirmed the unthinkable. The remains belonged to Sarah Mitchell. How did she end up there? Why the chimney of a remote cabin miles from her trail? And who, or what, put her there? Before we uncover the chilling truth behind Sarah's disappearance, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon. You won't want to miss the details of this case, because the truth is even darker than you think. Montana, a land of beauty and danger living side by side. Every year, thousands of hikers come here chasing peace in the wild, but not everyone returns. For Sarah Mitchell, the mountains she loved became the very place that claimed her. Her disappearance in 2018 shook her family, friends, and even strangers across the state. But it wasn't until 6 long years later that the truth, or at least part of it, came to light. Hidden inside the chimney of a cabin no one even knew existed anymore. The sun had only just begun to rise over the quiet town of Helena, Montana, when Sarah Mitchell's alarm went off. The soft golden light filtered through the thin curtains of her small apartment, spilling across the neatly made bed and the hiking gear she had laid out the night before. For Sarah, mornings like this were a kind of ritual. The quiet before the world fully woke up, the excitement of an adventure ahead. She stretched her arms above her head and took a deep breath, the faint scent of pine drifting in through the open window. Even before her feet touched the floor, she could feel the call of the mountains. She padded barefoot into the kitchen, where her old coffee maker was already gurgling. Sarah wasn't one to skip her morning coffee, especially on hiking days. She poured the steaming liquid into her favorite mug, the one with a faded picture of Glacier National Park printed on it, and took a slow sip. The warmth spread through her chest, waking her up in a way no alarm ever could. On the counter, her backpack sat ready, carefully packed with a water bottle, trail mix, a folded map, her small first aid kit, the bright orange whistle her father had given her years ago for safety. She always packed light, but she never forgot the essentials. Her sister, Emily, stopped by that morning before work. She leaned on the doorway, watching Sarah move around the kitchen with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Emily teased her, saying, "One day, you're going to run out of trails to explore." Sarah just smiled, brushing a stray hair from her face. "Not in Montana," she replied. "There's always somewhere new to see." She was dressed in her favorite hiking pants and a soft green t-shirt, with her well-worn boots already laced tightly on her feet. Emily noticed how happy she looked that morning, how there was a spark in her eyes. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was the promise of solitude in the mountains. But Sarah seemed lighter than she had in weeks. They talked for a few minutes, laughing about an inside joke from their childhood before Sarah slung her backpack over her shoulder and reached for the door. She paused just long enough to turn to Emily and say, "I'll be back before dinner. Love you." Emily smiled and said she'd save her a plate, not realizing that this simple exchange would replay in her mind 1,000 times in the years to come. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew on grass and the faint aroma of wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. The streets were quiet, only the distant hum of a truck somewhere down the road, breaking the stillness. Sarah climbed into her old Subaru, tossed her backpack into the passenger seat, and started the engine. The radio crackled to life with a country song she half sang along to as she drove out of town. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks catching the first rays of sunlight. And Sarah felt the familiar mix of excitement and peace that always came with being so close to nature. The drive to the trailhead took less than an hour. She wound her way along narrow roads lined with towering evergreens, their branches heavy with summer growth. The shadows shifted and danced as the sun climbed higher, and Sarah rolled down her window to feel the cool breeze on her face. She passed a few other early risers, a man loading fishing gear into the back of his truck, an older couple walking their dog, and offered a polite wave. By the time she reached the small gravel parking lot for the Pioneer Ridge Trail, there were only 2 other cars there. She parked near the edge, where she could see the beginning of the trail disappearing into the dense forest. After stepping out of the car, she took a moment to stretch, breathing in deeply. The air up here smelled different, purer, sharper, like the earth itself had been washed clean overnight. She adjusted the straps on her backpack and tightened the laces on her boots. There was a slight chill in the air, despite the sun, but she knew it would warm up quickly once she started moving. Sarah walked over to the small wooden sign that marked the trail. It was a familiar sight. The carved letters worn smooth by weather, the bulletin board with a map, and a few safety reminders tacked to it. She traced the route with her finger, not because she needed to, but out of habit. She knew this trail well, but she also knew the mountains could be unpredictable. Still, she felt confident. This was her element. Before stepping onto the dirt path, she pulled out her phone and snapped a quick picture of the trailhead. She sent it to Emily with the message, "Pioneer Ridge today. Be back before dinner." Emily replied with a thumbs-up emoji, not knowing that it would be the last text Sarah would ever send. As she began her hike, the forest seemed to welcome her. The morning sun streamed through the branches in golden shafts. The birdsong filled the air, and the sound of her boots crunching on the trail was steady and reassuring. She moved at an easy pace, stopping now and then to admire the way the light caught on the leaves, or to listen to the distant rush of water from a stream hidden somewhere in the trees. Everything about that morning felt alive and perfect, as if nothing bad could ever touch her here. She passed the mile marker without even noticing, lost in her own thoughts. She thought about the dinner she would have that night, the photos she'd send to her friends, maybe even a surprise visit to her mom over the weekend. She had no reason to believe this day would be any different from the countless hikes she had done before. But somewhere deeper in the forest, beyond the sunlight and the singing birds, something waited, something she could never have prepared for. And with every step she took, she was unknowingly walking closer to it.
The sun dipped below the horizon that evening, casting a golden glow over Helena's quiet streets, but Sarah Mitchell had not come home. At first, her family tried to push away the unease. Maybe she had taken a longer route. Maybe she'd stayed to watch the sunset from one of her favorite overlooks. But when the clock edged past 8 and her phone went straight to voicemail, worry began to creep in. Emily called her again and again, pacing the kitchen with a knot in her stomach. She told herself there had to be a simple explanation, but with every unanswered ring, that hope grew thinner. By the time darkness settled in, the worry had shifted to fear. Emily drove out to the Pioneer Ridge Trail herself, headlights cutting through the night as she wound along the familiar road. Her heart pounded when she spotted Sarah's old Subaru sitting alone in the gravel lot, exactly where she'd left it that morning. The windows were dark, the doors were locked. Inside, her sister's sunglasses sat on the dashboard, and an empty coffee cup was in the cup holder, as if she'd just stepped away for a moment. But the hours had already stretched too long. Emily called the sheriff's department from the parking lot, her voice shaking. Within an hour, a deputy arrived, his flashlight sweeping across the trees as he took her statement. They told her that official search efforts would begin at first light. That night, Emily barely slept, her mind racing with questions and worst-case scenarios. She kept replaying their last conversation, clinging to every word. She wished she had hugged her sister longer before she left that morning. She wished she had gone with her. At dawn, the mountains were alive with activity. Search and rescue teams gathered at the trailhead, deputies, trained volunteers, and even neighbors who had come to help. The air was cool and smelled faintly of damp earth, and the sound of boots crunching on gravel filled the silence. Helicopters thumped overhead, scanning the forest from above. Sarah's picture was passed from hand to hand, her smiling face printed on sheets of paper that would soon be tacked to trees, pinned to bulletin boards, and posted in every shop window in town. The first hours of the search brought cautious optimism. The trail was well marked, and Sarah knew it well. If she'd been injured, maybe she was waiting somewhere, signaling for help. Searchers fanned out in groups, some sticking to the main path while others pushed through underbrush, calling her name. The forest answered only with the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. By midday, a deputy radioed in with what felt like a breakthrough. They had found footprints that matched the tread of Sarah's boots. The prints followed the Pioneer Ridge Trail for a while before veering sharply off into thicker forest. It was a place few hikers ever ventured. The kind of wild growth that swallowed you whole if you didn't know where you were going. But if the prints were hers, it meant she had left the safety of the path for some reason. Searchers followed the trail of footprints with renewed urgency. The ground was uneven, covered in pine needles and tangled roots. The forest canopy here was so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground, casting everything in a greenish twilight. They called her name louder now, voices echoing between the trees. For a few hundred yards, the prints led them deeper into the wilderness. And then, they stopped. It wasn't gradual. One moment there were clear impressions in the soil. Heel, toe, and the next, there was nothing. No scuff marks. No broken branches. No disturbed leaves. Just undisturbed forest floor, as if she had stepped off the earth and vanished into thin air. Search dogs were brought in, eager and restless as they sniffed the ground where the tracks ended. At first, their handlers were hopeful. The dogs pulled forward, noses to the ground, tails wagging. But after only a few minutes, they slowed. They circled. They whined. And then, one by one, they sat down, confused. The scent was gone, completely gone. It made no sense. Even in difficult terrain, dogs could usually follow a trail for miles. The handlers exchanged uneasy glances. Some muttered about wind patterns or how the scent might have been washed away. But there had been no rain, no streams nearby, no explanation that fit the strangeness of it. The rest of the day was a blur of activity. Teams widening the search area, helicopters sweeping low over the treetops, radios crackling with updates that led nowhere. The forest seemed to resist giving up its secrets. Every shadow felt like it could be hiding her. Every distant movement made hearts jump, only to turn out to be a squirrel or a shifting branch. By nightfall, there was still no sign of Sarah. The teams returned to the trailhead, exhausted, their boots caked in mud, faces lined with frustration and worry. Emily stood apart from the others, staring into the dark mouth of the trail. She felt as if her sister was still out there, just beyond reach, waiting. The thought of her spending the night alone in the wilderness made Emily's chest ache. Over the next several days, the search grew larger. Volunteers came from neighboring towns. Experienced trackers studied the terrain. Drones scanned the forest from above, their cameras capturing every detail. Yet the result was always the same. Nothing. No torn clothing, no dropped backpack, no broken phone. It was as though the forest had opened up, taken her in, and closed again without leaving a trace. In the small town of Helena, the disappearance became the only thing people talked about. Coffee shops buzzed with theories. Some thought she had gotten lost and wandered too far. Others whispered darker ideas, that someone might have been waiting for her, that the wilderness wasn't the only danger out there. But in the absence of answers, all anyone could do was guess. Weeks turned into months. The search scaled back. The posters began to fade in the sunlight. Sarah's case was moved from active search to missing person investigation. For her family, that shift was like a final blow, an unspoken acknowledgement that the hope of finding her alive had all but slipped away. Emily refused to accept it. She kept calling the sheriff's office, kept organizing small search parties of her own. Each time, she returned empty-handed. Years later, when people would talk about Sarah, they would remember this part of the story as the most haunting. The way her trail simply ended. No sign of struggle, no evidence of where she went. Just a woman who stepped off the path one summer day and disappeared into the silence of Montana's endless wilderness. The days after the search began to fade were the hardest for Sarah's family. The first few weeks had been filled with frantic hope search teams combing the forests, volunteers walking endless miles, helicopters scanning from the sky. But as time passed, the reality settled in slowly, like a cold shadow creeping across their hearts. Weeks slipped into months, and the intensity of the search began to dim. The searchers packed up their gear one by one, believing they had looked everywhere they possibly could, but Sarah's family refused to let go. Emily, Sarah's sister, often sat alone in her room, staring at the wall where a photo of Sarah smiled back at her. Every phone call made her jump, her heart pounding with hope that maybe, just maybe, this call would bring news. But time and time again, it was silence. Holidays came and went, but their home was never quite the same. Christmas morning was quieter without Sarah's laughter filling the rooms. Birthdays, once full of joy and celebration, were now marked by empty chairs and painful memories. Sarah's mother struggled most of all. She kept Sarah's bedroom just as she had left it on that summer morning. The bed remained perfectly made, as if waiting for her daughter to return and lie down after a long day. On the hook by the door hung Sarah's favorite hiking hat, worn soft from many adventures. It was a small reminder of the life that had paused suddenly and painfully. Her mother would often sit there, tracing the edges of the hat with trembling fingers, whispering softly, "Come home, Sarah." The pain was constant and heavy, settling deep inside the family's hearts. Each day was a battle between holding on to hope and facing the unbearable possibility that Sarah might never come back. Friends and neighbors tried to offer comfort, but there was a hollow ache that no words could fill. The silence left behind by Sarah's absence echoed through their lives, a reminder that a part of them was missing and might never be found. Despite the growing despair, the family never stopped hoping. That hope became their lifeline. It was the fragile thread that pulled them through sleepless nights and tearful mornings. They clung to the belief that Sarah was still out there somewhere, that she might have found shelter or help and would come home when the time was right. This hope was their quiet rebellion against the darkness that threatened to swallow them whole.
Every year, on Sarah's birthday, her family gathered quietly to remember her. They lit candles, shared stories of happier times, and prayed for a miracle. Each candle's flame flickered with the memory of a sister, daughter, and friend who had vanished into the wilderness without a trace. These moments were bittersweet, filled with love, but heavy with loss. Sarah's friends also felt the weight of her absence. They kept her memory alive through shared photos, camping trips to the trails she loved, and stories that kept her spirit close. They too refused to believe that someone as vibrant and full of life as Sarah could simply disappear without a reason. Together they formed a community of remembrance, bound by grief and the stubborn hope that the story was not over. The years stretched on, but the wound never healed. Sarah's family continued to hold her place in their hearts, never giving up on the possibility that one day she might walk through the door again. They learned to live with the unanswered questions, the empty spaces, and the silence that filled their home. Yet beneath the sadness, there was always a flicker of hope. A hope that refused to die, even when the world seemed to have forgotten. Through it all, the mountains of Montana stood silent and unchanging. Their beauty was untouched by time, but for Sarah's family, they were a constant reminder of what was lost. The wilderness that had once brought Sarah so much joy had also taken her away, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt them forever. And until the day the truth was uncovered, they would carry her memory with them, in their hearts, in their prayers. And in the quiet moments when the world felt unbearably still, in the crisp air of early October 2024, Eli Turner set out on what he expected to be a routine elk hunt, deep in the remote wilderness of Montana. The landscape around him was vast and wild, rolling hills cloaked in golden autumn leaves, forests thick with towering pines, and trails so faint that only the most experienced could navigate them without getting lost. Eli had hunted these parts for years, but even he knew that venturing this far from the marked trails was risky. Still, the thrill of the chase and the quiet solitude of the backcountry pulled him further into the wilderness, away from the noise of towns and roads. As the day wore on, the sky began to darken with heavy clouds, and a sudden snow flurry caught Eli off guard. The delicate white flakes swirled around him, quickly covering the earth in a thin, icy blanket. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind howled through the trees like a warning. Eli knew he couldn't risk being caught out in the open with the weather turning so quickly. He needed shelter and fast. Scanning the rugged landscape, Eli spotted the silhouette of an old log cabin nestled between two large pine trees. The structure looked abandoned and forgotten, its wooden walls worn smooth by decades of storms and harsh Montana winters. The roof sagged heavily, as if weighed down by years of snow and neglect, and the windows were shattered, dark holes staring blankly into the forest. Dust and spider webs coated every surface visible through the broken glass, and ivy clung stubbornly to the cracked walls. For a moment, Eli considered turning back, uneasy about entering such a derelict place. But the growing snow and the bitter cold left him no choice. He pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The cabin's interior was cloaked in shadows, the weak afternoon light barely penetrating through the broken windows. The air smelled stale and musty, thick with the scent of old wood and decay. Eli's boots disturbed decades of dust, sending tiny clouds swirling in the cold air. He started to explore the small cabin, looking for any sign of a safe place to rest until the storm passed. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the walls seemed to close in around him. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had been here for years. He brushed his hand along the edge of a broken table and startled a cloud of dried leaves and dirt. Nothing else appeared out of place until his eyes landed on the stone chimney that dominated one corner of the room. At first, the chimney seemed just as worn and lifeless as the rest of the cabin. But then Eli noticed something pale wedged deep within the dark opening. His heart skipped a beat, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. He crouched down and peered closer, his breath catching in his throat. The pale shapes were unmistakable bones, human bones. For a moment, he thought he must be mistaken. Perhaps it was the remains of some large animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the shapes were too thin, too delicate. There was a skull, cracked and aged, staring back at him with empty eye sockets. The jawbone lay askew, and fragments of ribs and long bones peeked out from the shadows inside the chimney. A heavy silence filled the cabin as the full weight of his discovery settled on Eli's shoulders. He felt a mix of horror and disbelief, the kind of shock that numbs the senses. His mind raced, questions flooding in all at once. Who was this person? How did they end up here in this forgotten cabin, hidden away in the wilderness? How long had the remains been here, waiting to be found? Eli's fingers trembled as he reached for his phone to call the local authorities. The snowstorm outside continued to rage, but inside that old cabin, time seemed to stand still. He knew this discovery was no accident. It was a clue to a mystery that had haunted Montana for years. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on him, but he felt a quiet resolve settle deep within. This was not just the remains of a stranger. It was a chance to bring answers to a family that had waited far too long. As he waited for the deputies to arrive, Eli paced the cabin, trying to make sense of what he had found. Every creak of the old wood, every whisper of the wind outside, reminded him of the stories he'd heard, stories of a woman who had vanished years ago on a hike not far from here, like Sarah Mitchell. Her face had been on missing person posters pinned all over town. Could this be the place where her journey ended? When the search teams finally arrived, the cabin was filled with a tense energy, a mixture of sorrow and grim determination. The forensic experts moved carefully, documenting every bone, every fragment. The news spread quickly, rippling through the small communities nearby. For the first time in 6 years, there was a flicker of hope mingled with grief. Eli stood outside the cabin, watching as the investigators worked. The mountains around them were silent witnesses to the secret they had just uncovered. The forest, vast and unyielding, had kept its secret well, but now, thanks to a hunter's unexpected shelter from a sudden storm, that secret was finally beginning to come to light. The truth about what happened deep in Montana's wilderness was about to unfold, and it all started here, inside that lonely, forgotten cabin, with its weathered walls and the chilling discovery hidden within its stone chimney. The moment Eli Turner made the chilling discovery inside that old Montana cabin, he knew the authorities had to be called immediately. He stepped out into the cold, snow swirling around him as he fumbled with his phone. Hands trembling not just from the cold, but from the weight of what he had uncovered. The gravity of the situation pressed down on him like the heavy Montana sky overhead. Each ring of the phone seemed to echo into the wilderness as he relayed the grim news to the local sheriff's office. Within hours, a team of deputies and forensic experts arrived, their presence breaking the eerie silence that had settled over the remote forest. They moved quickly, but carefully, knowing they were dealing with something far more serious than a forgotten cabin in the woods. The specialists took photographs, measured every corner, and began the slow, methodical process of retrieving the remains from the chimney's narrow, shadowed depths. The air was thick with a somber quiet, the kind of silence that fills a room when everyone understands the weight of loss and the importance of the moment. As the bones were carefully collected and transported to the lab, the entire community waited with bated breath, holding on to the fragile hope that these remains might finally bring some closure to a story that had haunted them for 6 long years. Days passed slowly, every hour stretching longer than the last, until the forensic team finally had the answers they needed. The confirmation came like a sudden, sharp breath. The remains were those of Sarah Mitchell. The news rippled through the small towns and forests of Montana like a cold wind. For Sarah's family, it was a moment of indescribable pain mixed with relief. After years of not knowing, the mystery was no longer about if she was alive, but how she had ended up so far from the trail where she had last been seen. The discovery deepened the anguish because it raised more questions than it answered. Sarah's last known location was miles away from the cabin, across terrain so rough and wild that even the most skilled hikers would think twice before attempting to cross it without a clear path. The 6-mile distance wasn't just a simple walk, it was a treacherous journey through dense forest, steep slopes, and unforgiving wilderness. There were no marked trails leading to the cabin, no signs that anyone had recently passed through. How had Sarah ended up here, and why? The forensic experts examined the remains and the cabin itself, trying to piece together the story the mountains were keeping silent about. The chimney, where Sarah's bones were found, was especially perplexing. It was narrow and dark, almost impossible for someone to climb into by accident. The very thought of someone entering that tight space, whether alone or forced, sent chills through everyone involved in the investigation. Questions swirled like the autumn leaves outside the cabin. Was Sarah hiding from something or someone? Had she sought shelter in desperation? Or was the cabin a place of danger rather than refuge? The answers felt just out of reach, slipping through their fingers like dust in the wind. Sarah's family struggled with these questions. The hope they had clung to for so long was replaced by a raw, aching grief, mixed with the frustration of knowing there was still so much left unsaid. Every detail about the cabin's location and condition seemed to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. The authorities continued their investigation, searching the area for clues, interviewing anyone who might have seen something, anything, in the years since Sarah disappeared. But the wilderness was vast and indifferent, holding its secrets tight beneath the canopy of pine and the endless Montana sky. For the people who loved Sarah, this discovery was both a heartbreak and a release. At last they knew where she was, but they were left with a silence that echoed louder than words, a silence filled with all the questions that could never be answered. And so the cabin stood quietly in the forest, a stark reminder of a young woman's last journey, one that ended far from the paths. She knew in a place so remote and mysterious that only the mountains themselves held the full truth. The discovery of Sarah's remains inside the old cabin's chimney opened a door to countless questions, questions that seemed impossible to answer, no matter how hard investigators and her family tried. Why was Sarah in that cabin so far from the trail she had planned to hike? How did she come to be inside a narrow, dark chimney, a place so small and difficult to access that it seemed almost impossible for anyone to climb into on their own? These were the first mysteries that gripped everyone who heard the news. Some people believed Sarah had been running from someone. The idea was chilling, but not impossible. Maybe she had encountered danger on the trail, someone who threatened her safety and had fled into the wilderness, seeking shelter wherever she could find it. Perhaps the cabin was her last refuge, a desperate attempt to hide, protect herself, and wait for help that never came. The thought that she had been terrified, alone, and struggling to survive added a sharp ache to the story. Others thought she might have been hiding, not necessarily from a person, but from a situation. Maybe Sarah had felt overwhelmed or frightened by something in her life, and had wandered off the trail intentionally, seeking peace or escape in the solitude of the forest. The cabin, old and forgotten, might have seemed like a safe place, a small shelter where she could gather her strength. But even this softer theory was tinged with sadness, because it meant she had been lost and alone in the wild for so long. However, there was a darker, more frightening possibility. Some feared that Sarah had not gone into that chimney on her own will. The idea that someone else had forced her there, hidden her body in the chimney to ensure she would never be found, cast a shadow over the entire case. It raised terrifying questions about violence and cruelty in the wilderness, about secrets kept behind closed doors, and about the hidden dangers that can lurk far from the eyes of civilization. The cabin's remote location, far from any trail or road, only made this theory more plausible and haunting. Sarah's family was caught between these different possibilities, their emotions tangled and raw. There was a strange kind of relief that came with finally knowing where Sarah had been all these years. After 6 long years of searching and hoping, there was an end to the uncertainty. But that relief was instantly overshadowed by heartbreak, because the answers they so desperately needed remained just out of reach. How and why Sarah had died was still a mystery, leaving them with nothing but painful questions. The silence surrounding her final moments was suffocating. Every theory seemed incomplete, every guess frustrating. Her loved ones longed for closure, a clear story to help them heal. But instead, they were left with a haunting unknown, a puzzle missing its final vital pieces. The cabin, the chimney, the wilderness, all seemed to guard their secrets fiercely, refusing to give up the truth. Investigators worked tirelessly, piecing together what they could from the evidence, but many key details remained elusive. The forest had swallowed not just Sarah's footsteps, but also the answers she had. And in the quiet moments when her family sat together and talked, the weight of these unanswered questions pressed heavily on their hearts. They wondered if the truth would ever surface, or if it would be lost forever in the Montana wilderness. Despite the pain, Sarah's family tried to hold on to hope that someday, somehow, justice would be served. They kept her memory alive with love and determination, refusing to let her story fade into silence. Each unanswered question became a reminder of the fight they continued, a promise that they would not stop searching until they understood what really happened. The mountains and forests around the cabin remained still and mysterious, bearing witness to the past and keeping their secrets close. For Sarah's family and the community, the story was far from over. It was a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be, and how sometimes, even after years of waiting, the hardest truths are the ones left unsaid. The day of Sarah's memorial was heavy with emotion, a gathering of family, friends, and community members all drawn together by grief and the need to say goodbye. The chapel was quiet, except for the soft whispers of people sharing memories, wiping tears and holding on to each other for comfort. Sarah's face looked peaceful in the framed photo at the front, her smile captured in a moment of happiness that now seemed both distant and painfully close. Her absence filled the room like an invisible weight, a reminder of the years spent searching and hoping, and now finally facing the reality of loss. Her sister Emily stood before the crowd, her voice trembling as she began to speak. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she tried to find the words to capture 6 years of waiting, wondering, and wishing. 6 years, she said. I imagined 100 different endings. Her voice broke, but she pressed on, each word heavy with pain and love. None of them were this. The silence that followed was thick and raw. The truth was hard to accept that Sarah's story had ended not with a joyful reunion, but with a sorrow so deep it felt endless. Yet in that same breath, Emily found a small comfort. But at least now I know where she is. She's not out there in the cold anymore. Those words carried the weight of relief mixed with heartbreaker, bittersweet truth that brought some peace, even as it opened old wounds. The mountains of Montana, towering and majestic, stood silently outside the chapel's windows. They remained as beautiful and wild as ever, untouched by the years or the pain that had unfolded beneath their watchful gaze. Most people, these mountains were a place of wonder, adventure, and escape. But for Sarah's family and friends, the landscape was forever changed. The same trails she had loved now felt shadowed by loss and mystery. Every tree and rocky ridge whispered memories of her last hike, the unknown journey she had taken, and the silence that followed. Walking those paths, once filled with hope and excitement, now brought a quiet ache. The wilderness that had called to Sarah's adventurous spirit had become a reminder of how fragile life can be, and how easily it can slip away. Her absence was felt in the rustling leaves, in the cold mountain air, and in the empty spaces where her laughter once echoed. It was a reminder of the unanswered questions, the what-ifs, and the longing that never truly fades. Friends and family gathered after the memorial, sharing stories of Sarah's kindness, her love for the outdoors, and the light she brought into their lives. They spoke of her bravery and her zest for life, trying to hold on to the parts of her that no darkness could take away. Their voices were soft but determined, a collective promise that Sarah's memory would live on, even if her story ended too soon. In the quiet moments after everyone had gone home, Emily sat alone, feeling the weight of grief settle deep within her chest. The loss was vast and raw, but beneath the sorrow was a fierce love that would carry her through the years ahead. She knew that healing would not come quickly or easily, but she also knew that remembering Sarah with tenderness and strength was the first step. The mountains would keep their secrets, and the mystery of Sarah's last hike would linger like a shadow over the land she loved. But in the hearts of those who loved her, she remained alive, her spirit as wild and free as the Montana wilderness itself. Her story was a reminder of both the beauty and the danger of the world, of the love that binds us and the pain that shapes us. And through it all, her memory shone like a beacon, guiding those she left behind toward hope, healing, and the courage to keep moving forward. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Sarah's story, a tale of adventure, mystery, and heartbreaking loss deep in the wilds of Montana. Her disappearance and the discovery that followed remind us how fragile life can be, and how the unanswered questions can linger long after the trail has gone cold. If this story touched you, please subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a moment of the mysteries we explore together. And share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. What do you think really happened to Sarah on that fateful hike? Remember, every story has its shadows, but by searching for answers and sharing them, we keep the light alive. Until next time, stay safe and keep wondering.